The large apple orchards in our area near Chesham were planted about 100 years ago. During the last 2 years, they've gone. This one was at the end of Grove Lane, where my farm is. When I was a boy, pudding almost always meant apple pie, apple dumplings, or stewed apple. But people don't eat so many cooking apples these days. And if people don't eat them, my neighbours can't grow them. Now potatoes grow where the trees used to be, and it doesn't look so pretty. Who changed the view, the farmer or the people who don't buy apples? You feel now that the population, the urban population, isn't on your side anymore. In times of war and afterwards, they were definitely on your side. They were worried about their own food, and so they were prepared to be sympathetic towards farmers changing their methods from traditional methods that looked picturesque to modern ones that didn't look so picturesque. Now, there's no sign of a shortage of food in the Western world. And therefore, people look on the countryside no longer as somewhere to grow food. They look at it as somewhere where they will enjoy themselves at the weekend. And the view becomes more important than the product. For me, this field of poppies provides a dramatic example of the conflict of view between farmers and the rest. Is it beautiful, or is it a disaster? I saw it from over a mile away, and when I arrived there was a queue of urban people taking pictures. Cars passing by would stop and admire. It doesn't seem that way to the farmer. To him it represents a failure. Either a failure on his part, he dropped his guard and didn't do what he should have done, or a failure of science in that the spray that he thought was going to kill the poppies didn't. Either way, a failure which he'll be somewhat ashamed and wish to hide up perhaps, and he'll lose quite a lot in his crop by it. In fact, he burnt it all to prevent the poppies seeding. Mostly nowadays, weeds and flowers only survive around the edges. The sprays we use on the crops work, and it all looks different. We're not the only ones who are changing the countryside. What was a small rural community has been altered dramatically in my lifetime by improved transport. Now we're almost an outer suburb of London. For the most part, these people don't work here. They live here and would like to come home to a countryside of apple blossom and poppies. That's why they came. But they've made changes too. This was an open common grazed by sheep, and with just a few golden gorse bushes in the spring and raspberries in the summer. You could see right across it. The sheep went because of the traffic, and thorns and oaks sprang up. Homes have been built round the edge, and what was the blacksmith sells lawnmowers. The pub has ploughman's lunches, but not a ploughman in sight. People come from miles around to enjoy the fresh air and what's left of the countryside. If it wasn't for the space kept clear for the golfers, the whole common would revert to the forest of 2,000 years ago. Since the war, the population of Chesham has more than doubled, and there are houses where fields used to be. This is Gooseacre, though there aren't any geese there anymore. The farmhouses have been gentrified and the land sold off to neighbouring farmers. This was 4 farm labourers' cottages. Today it's one big house. Now it's the turn of barns and other old buildings. A very first memory where I slept in Little Grove over the way, I could see, when the leaves went on the trees, just a big black building. And it was the barn that we're now converting. Built, the authorities say, in the 17th century, as a thrashing barn. In those days, every farm would have a thrashing barn, and for the whole of the winter, the men would be employed in thrashing the corn by hand there. It was too narrow to use for modern implements. Our first grain dryer went in it and nearly shook it to pieces, and 2 years ago was going derelict. And the authorities came and served an order on me that it was a scheduled building and mustn't be allowed to fall down. So I discussed with them what to do, and they said, well, you mustn't allow it to fall down. If you do, you'll be prosecuted very probably. But on the other hand, you could preserve it by converting it into a house, and we will support you with the local planning authority. This is happening all over the place here. So now, the only building to dwell in that you can now build in this greenbelt area is a barn converted to a house. That's the only form of extra dwelling you can provide, because they want you to preserve it, because black wooden buildings have now suddenly become beautiful. They weren't built by architects to be beautiful. They're purely functional buildings. The house at Grove Farm, where I live now, has been through several stages. From a house it was converted to a barn, and then, some say, a chapel. 25 years ago, I turned it back into a house. Nowadays, my major interest on the farm is the Charolais cattle. My son Dan and I have a pedigree herd. We send breeding animals all over Britain, often the best going to Scotland, and some abroad when the opportunity arises. Our acreage has gone from 200 when I first began to 800. We've had to expand where land was available, so we're rather scattered, and it's quite a job to get round and see it all. The price of land has been going up all the while, very slowly at first, accelerating after the war, and absolutely rocketing in the 60s. In this semi-residential area, the national trend has been exaggerated. So now, the capital value of a farm has little or no relationship to its annual yield.
If I wasn't so interested in using the land for agriculture, which is ingrained into me, I really ought to be thinking about using it perhaps for leisure purposes. Perhaps at Dungrove, which is a lovely spot, we should have a golf course. But I wouldn't want to live here if we did. I should want to go somewhere else and find a place to farm.
Whereas I own my farm, Dan rents his from the church.
The ownership of land doesn't interest me at all. The ownership of land is unimportant to anybody unless they're thinking about money. Then it becomes something in the bank to sell should times come hard or if you change your mind. My responsibility to the countryside is that I'm a steward. I'm not here for very long. I must look after it. I must also make a living out of it. The use of the land is important to the farmer, and I'm quite happy to be a tenant. I'd rather be a tenant using the church's money than I would be a landowner with perhaps on this farm £800,000 of my money tied up, earning a very small amount. If we look at the assets that we use on this farm, it may be as much as £2 million, the total assets. We get a small return, relatively speaking. If we were to give up and have all those assets turned into cash, not that they're all ours, some of the assets belong to my landlord, but if we were to use those proportion of assets for spending money, then we would be wealthy. There are plenty of rich farmers. They're rich the day they give up.
It seemed to me dangerous and undesirable that now it's nearly impossible for new people to get into farming. Annual production at £300 an acre is a poor return on land purchased at £2,000 an acre. Ben Boughton is a leading light in the National Farmers Union and has strong opinions on this.
The young farmer just started, either bought his farm at a high price and perhaps also with a big overdraft. He will find times very difficult indeed when grain prices drop. The long-established farmer with no overdraft, owning his farm, no mortgage, he'll survive with very considerable price cuts. And it'll be very unfortunate if we keep the old men in business and the young men can't make a living.
Our own family situation puts it in pretty dramatic contrast. My farm I bought after the war for somewhat less than £40 an acre, and I've no mortgage on it. Dan's farm was rented last year at £40 an acre. So his annual rent is as much as my capital cost. And we get exactly the same amount for the corn grown on one farm as we do for the corn grown on the other farm. Exactly the same amount. And in the 20s, wheat was £5 a tonne. Now it's gone up to over 100. But the real price has gone down. The sale of 1 tonne used to pay one man's wages for 3 weeks. Now it only pays 1 week. But it's still our major crop. The market always decided what you grew. The way you market is decided by what transport's available to you. In primitive times, when the method of transport was a horse and cart, you must have concentrated on what you could use locally and what you could sell locally, and tried to produce a wide range of products for local population. The first big change in transport in this area would have been the canal coming to Berkhamsted. And as soon as that canal was there, you could send things into London, things that kept. And they started off by sending in things like cheese, but also cows, because they travelled better than the milk did. The milk would be produced fresh in backyards in London. But then the railway came soon afterwards, and the railway being much faster, you could then start sending fresh milk into London. Now, of course, the method of transport is the plane or the fast lorry and the big tanker, and so you've got an ever-widening market. Therefore, everybody has got down to specialisation, and it is dangerous, producing just one or two things, and all of a sudden, nobody wants it very much. So right now, at the moment, we're really looking into this diversification because we feel under threat. So long as the barley and wheat market were guaranteed and good and rape was developing all the time, we didn't feel under threat. Now we hear every day, every week of our lives about surpluses and that the price will be down further next year.
There's no way that the EC is going to limit production by price restraint without causing an enormous upset in the countryside. And that upset is not acceptable to any of the political parties in this country. So ultimately, they will have to have quotas. Then they have to use spies in the sky or whatever to check that we only grow that acreage which we're allowed to grow. Since the war, we've had an almost unparalleled length of time where farmers have been in a secure financial world. I can't recall from my history that there have been 45 years where people have been secure in agriculture. I mean, historically it goes up and down. I think now we're heading towards a down, and surviving in it may prove difficult.
Days gone by, if the corn market wasn't good, you changed over just a bit to livestock. But now the meat market is fully supplied. There's constant propaganda against eating red meat, so we're unlikely to be able to increase the market for red meat. In addition to that, the pig and poultry men have become technically so very, very efficient with factory or semi-factory farming that they can produce white meat very much cheaper than you can produce red meat. So for the ordinary general farmer, there are not so many alternatives available as there used to be. So naturally, we've had to open up our mind to new ideas. To survive, some farmers have turned to contracting. One local family, the Newmans, who've been in small farms for 4 generations, instead of buying extra land, have bought big machines. They do their own harvest and then work for us and other neighbours. A combine at £50,000 is not economic for us to buy, so we contract out. There'll be more of that in the future. As a byproduct of the enormous increase in grain production in the last few years, there is a huge surplus of straw. All the straw used to be used on farms by the cattle, horses and the rest of it, and returned to the land. Well, now we produce so much more, it wouldn't be possible. People would never eat enough meat to warrant the keeping of all those cattle. So the next thing which is required of the scientists by us is a means of using all this vast quantity of cellular material, the straw, which we're criticised for burning, but somebody will have to invent a way of using it. It's the first time we've tried this on our farm. The idea is to treat the straw with ammonia to make it more easily digestible for the cattle. The ammonia breaks down the fibre in the straw, and it's only a matter of days before it can be used as a substitute for hay. Another potential outlet for straw is fuel. If it could be compressed into a dense enough state, it would be very useful, with about the same calorific value as coal. We can advance as far as scientists will enable us. Perhaps the most advanced bit of science we use on our farm is embryo transplants. These white Charolais calves were born to brown Guernsey mothers.
By the process of transplantation of developing embryos at about 8 days old,
we're able to have had, in the last 4 years, 11 calves from the one cow. And by normal process, the best we could have done is
4 or 5 calves. The Guernseys can't tell the difference. As far as they know, they had a calf which they believe to be theirs, and they take to them just as they would their own.
With all the scientific and engineering changes, some things don't change. Calves are born as they always have been.